Does anything we do even matter anyway? Today on the Man Space. Welcome to the Man Space podcast. We're your hosts, Doctors Matt Brown and Rob Porter, and clinical therapist Mike Porter. Welcome, spacemen, to what might be a very depressing episode. Or it might not be, I don't know. You guys have missed a whole episode all by itself. The listeners, the spacemen. I had a client on the phone today. I was like, listen, dude, I know you're a loyal spaceman. And he starts laughing. He's like, why do you say that? I was like, I say it because I'm plugging my own podcast in this session. And that's like, I have to make it sound like you already listened anyway, right? Because otherwise it sounds like I'm saying there's a groundbreaking new book out.
Hey, hot tip. If you take one of your AirPods out, our conversation feels normal.
Does it?
Like one of them. Then you're just hearing me and not the watching my mouth and then hearing the delay.
Well, I mean, I'm hearing you.
Well, yeah, but just in one ear. Got one
That's
good
true.
ear.
Okay.
I was having a hard time following you a second ago with both of them in.
That delay is pretty significant.
Yeah, and sometimes choppy. And I can hear myself.
Hey, Mike's here too.
Mike, you moving to Kansas City just ruined our technology.
Seriously.
I don't know. I feel like we had trouble with it anyway.
That's true. Technology ruined our technology. Still, I love technology. Boy, it's kind of chilly in here.
It's because I turned it down.
What'd you turn it down to?
Apparently me and Rob existed in two different hemispheres this morning because I'm wearing a hoodie and jeans and he's wearing flip-flops and shorts.
Dude, it's gonna be like 82 today or something here.
If I could wear hoodies like every day,
Oh, yeah?
I would.
Really?
They're just comfortable.
So it's
I would.
t-shirts.
Yeah.
I win.
Not as
Hey, Mike, you're here.
you gotta have layers, Rob.
I typed into my search bar, "Why do men?"
That's
all.
it?
Yeah,
Oh.
to see what would come up. And then what came up was this article from the Harvard Business Review, "What Do Men Want?" from 1993. And this is what's interesting to me is this book talks about, or this article is talking about men, and he's referencing a psychiatrist named Willard Galen who wrote The Male Ego. And it says
In the 90s.
1992 was published, so it is 30 years old. And he says Galen accurately captures the ambivalence and frustration of many men. He says, for example, that I have never met a man among my patients or friends who in his heart of hearts considers himself a success. Just that part by itself, I'm like, have we not gotten any better? Like most men I talk to feel like. Then I thought I looked this up because Mike had a whole bunch of things, which Mike will have you get into a second. But we also had a commenter on YouTube say something that I was like, well, dude, that's not cool for a number of reasons. But basically just called us, I guess we'll just say called us gay.
No,
Which-
well,
He said we're fruits. We're a bunch
Yeah.
of fruits. Because the short was about.
so this is the interesting thing. The short was like us talking about different ways to let go of feelings,
Yeah.
right? So like we were saying, you don't necessarily have to talk about it to let a feeling go.
Yeah.
Fruits.
But this is what I thought when I thought, yeah, just because we said the word feelings, he's like, what a bunch of fruits,
Yeah.
And I thought, I think so. We're still at this space where we will basically tell people if you think this way or talk this way, you're either a woman, which apparently is a bad thing, or gay, which is also apparently a bad thing. So that has not progressed from the 1990s.
Yeah.
Even though I think there is there are areas where it has. I feel like largely it has not. Maybe that's just me being a pessimist. But then this book that's saying he's describing men who feel like they are not a success he has the three topics. Let me make sure I use the three words correctly. He's got protector, procreator, and provider. And says any man he knows basically does not feel like a success, period, in those areas. And he even said that there are CEOs who've lived a, quote unquote successful life. And as soon as they retire, they're like, my life is meaningless. I have no point. There's no reason for me to exist. And so I think about this and I think, I thought, weird. After 2+ years of doing this man space thing, we have not changed this dynamic yet. And then I thought, stupid history, man, that like it always just keeps doing the same thing over and over. Mm-hmm. And we never seem to, we don't figure, it's fascinating to read histories just whether they're kind of the boring kind or people who write them really well, where it's like, huh, you guys were thinking that back then too, huh? That looks exactly how we think. We just have a different name for it. Like I watched maybe I think I mentioned this. I mentioned it to my parents anyway. That movie that came out last year, I think for Christmas. It was the 8-Bit Christmas. It was on like HBO.
Oh,
it was
yeah.
it was basically like it was the Toy Story, not Toy Story. It was the a Christmas story for the 80s. So instead of this kid, he's going back and reliving his memories of the 80s and how he really wanted a Nintendo system. And his pride.
That sounds like a good movie.
It is pretty solid. It's a dumb Christmas movie, but it's good.
Yeah.
But like
it's Neil Patrick Harris, right?
Yeah, he's in it. He's kind of the adult version of this kid.
Oh, okay.
But in it, I was describing this to my parents about how history just repeats itself. Like right now, I worry about stuff with my kids. I worry that if they spend too much time on social media, they're going to turn out like idiots, or they're going to be whatever, or if they spend too much time playing video games, which actually has not changed, because in this movie it's talking about video games are going to destroy our society. There's all these moms protesting.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah, my parents were saying you have it harder. And I said, yes and no. I mean, you guys just had the same principle. You worried your kids were going to turn out like idiots and be corrupted, and it was just the source of that was a different source, but it's all the same patterns over and over.
Yeah.
So then I read this book from 1993 from 30 years ago, and basically it says, oh, nothing has changed. We're making this massive push towards mental health, and specifically mental health for men. And still as much as we try to do it, we still have this narrative that's like, well, I mean, one of my clients was asking me 2 days ago. He said, I mean, we do define ourselves. He said he read some book or heard a podcast where they said, we always ask, what do you do?
Yeah.
Like, we don't ask, what do you like or what are your hobbies? We say, what do you do? And specifically, everybody knows that means, what do you do for a living?
Yeah.
Because that is how I can then know you and categorize you. So that hasn't changed. Like, so it does feel like, it feels like, turn the podcast off now. This doesn't work. But Mike, you have some examples too that I think pull those out, because there's some things where I feel like, seriously, we still haven't moved past that? Oh, that is a serious delay.
Well, that's the first one I came across. Yeah. I came across an article the other day, and it was a guy writing into what I can only assume is the male version of Dear Abby. And he right. His question for Quentin, that was the guy's name. He said, I felt humiliated. She slipped the waiter her credit card on her way to the restroom. Is it emasculating for a woman to pay for dinner on a first date? And he goes through and kind of outlines the night. And then he basically says, I felt really emasculated because she paid. Like, it was this restaurant that I'd chosen and it was a little more expensive. So I had intended to pay. And she said, no, I got it. And went and on her way to the bathroom, slipped her credit card to the waiter so that she could pay the bill. And like the guy, he said he still ended up going on a second date with her. Like, it didn't ruin it for him, but he really struggled with this feeling of like, I guess I'm not a man because I didn't pay. And I saw it and I thought basically what you've been saying, Rob, like, seriously, this is where we are. Like, we're still
based on
we're
what
still
you
worried
read
about that
from that book. Same again. Provider, procreator,
Protector.
All three of those things are a man is what a woman needs. So
yeah,
in this case, she does not need him. So I could see where that would be emasculating if your definition of manhood is
but that's part of the
something that a woman needs.
But that's part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
Is that I guess that's part of what I'm saying is we have not learned how to define ourselves differently. Like, if we even hint at the idea of talking about feelings, we're called gay. And if some woman pays, now admittedly, I feel like, hey, look, I took you on a date. I'm going to pay for you. But my dad raised me. We've talked about this before. He raised me to make sure that I open the door until my wife basically trained me out of that. She's like, you don't need to come open the door for me. I was like, okay. But I feel like I feel like as much as we seem to try to, we have this war on toxicity, male toxicity, or toxic masculinity, but we're not bothering to actually reframe what a man is. Mm-hmm. So that's the part that feels discouraging. It's like, well, what are we doing? Like, is there an active effort to say, hey, let's decide for ourselves as men? Maybe that's too broad, but individually, but also collectively, like let's decide what it means to be a man. Like, which people try to do. It's not like they're not trying.
No, that's what I
It's
was going to
just
say. I think there's plenty of people talking about that, but understandably, like the first reaction to anything like that is to label it as something that's toxic or undesirable in some way. The guys that we're talking to now were raised by the guys that were dealing with that, and so I think obviously the problem is still going to be the same. But I think the guys our age, I mean, we're the ones having these conversations more or less. So what will the next generation of guys be like, right? Will there be, because I think that kind of like we talked about last week, it's like, hey, remember that absolute rule we had for when a kid does something you don't want and we tell them no? Well, now let's tell them, something completely opposite in an absolute way. I think labeling things as toxic, I think the only thing toxic about we'll say like masculinity or anything like that is to say, this is the one way to be.
yeah.
Right. Like, but that doesn't mean that if I'm saying, no, there are more ways to be, that I'm not also saying, also, you can be the way that I just said you don't have to be. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
if you are somebody who pays and that's important to you, there's nothing wrong with that, right? So I don't have to I just feel like we have this tendency to, it's almost like if I feel like something needs to change, I have to completely destroy it.
Oh man, hold on. Yes.
Instead of
I gotta find this quote.
Let me adapt it or contextualize it or bring the good parts of it and leave what doesn't work. Like we're just so quick to say get that out of here, but then there's a void, like you're saying, like what are we replacing it with, and or the things that we bring into the discussion just cast out right away, so we're left with this like a man is a hole basically, like a void, like I don't know what to do.
Now there's just dead silence. Dead air.
It's the void. It's the man void.
I got to find that. I was waiting for Mike to say something, but he's probably over there being like, I can't. You guys are too delayed. I wanted to find a quote because it has to do with this thing you just said that I was like, oh, dude, I read
Actually, as you're looking that up, Jordan Peterson has a really good description of this in general when he talks about, what is it called? Treasure Island and Pinocchio, where it's like, the only way to have something different is to completely tear down and destroy the ideal.
Dude, this is
and then it just leads to chaos.
Yeah, this quote that I said, basically that I'm trying to find that I can't find anymore, but it basically said the same idea that like you can't have enlightenment without, basically it said it has to be destructive. Mm-hmm. You can only tear down all the truth that you've known before and basically say none of that is true.
Yeah.
And I thought, what? That's like saying that, like, because even then I think, well, then to continue a process of enlightenment, you're going to always have to just keep tearing everything down over and over and over again.
Yeah. And
basically just decide new truths over and over again.
Yeah.
There is no solid anything anymore. Mm-hmm. That it just feels like, I don't know if I think it was what you're describing leads to chaos. Oh, here it is. Make no mistake about it. Enlightenment is a destructive process. It has nothing to do with becoming better or being happier. Enlightenment is the crumbling away of untruth.
Well, there you go.
It's seeing through the facade of pretense. It's the complete eradication of everything we imagine to be true.
Yeah.
I feel like, wait, what?
Well, and that's a prime example, right? When you think of masculinity and maybe something like strength, right? Or stoicism. So if the untruth in that is that to be a man, you absolutely have to possess these qualities, then get rid of that. But don't throw out stoicism and strength. Like those are still valuable. So I agree. There is destruction in the sense that you have to tear away the things that are no longer useful to you. But rebuilding or retaining, again, is totally lost in conversations that are polarized because it's just like, well, you're wrong here. Well, you're wrong here. Well, you're wrong here. Right. And it's just like back and forth and back and forth. Yeah.
And it's such a dramatic and definitive, like to say it has to be the eradication of everything you imagine to be true. I feel like, what? Then that would be chaos over and over again. You're just going to keep stepping into chaos, never reaching enlightenment because there's no possibility to. You can't build on anything.
Yeah.
But also there's this idea that's like, if we're saying that still now 30 years later, we still define ourselves by what job we have, the roles we serve in terms of our relationship to women, then we're just Ken. It's Barbie and Ken. But instead of saying, kind of like when you're saying, I met with somebody recently who talked about their faith background, and how it has repressed them sexually. And she's like, but I still want to be a part of this faith. And I was like, okay, well, you can be a part of that faith and not be repressed sexually. Like, it's going to take, it's not taking and necessarily throwing out that thing. It's saying, how do I reframe this? How do I look at this differently than I have? So like, I think about this and I think, there's an element of, how do we take something like our jobs, knowing that it would be ridiculous to say we are not defined by our jobs, period. I like to tell people that, but I also know, I feel very strongly that like my job, my career is very, very much linked to my identity. And that's not necessarily true for everybody, but I think specifically in fields like helping fields, or like being a teacher or being a doctor or being a therapist, it's like, well, there is a little bit of like, we are defined by that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't know that I should, but I can totally catch myself doing it.
Yeah.
So I think then how do we reframe this so it's a movement, and in addition to, instead of eradicating all things we once imagined to be true, how does it become a movement towards like, how do I add to or reframe what I was looking at? How do I say that my job is part of who I am, or part of what I am is a protector and a provider and a procreator. I'm going to start putting that on a business card, procreator. But also like, I think that just has to be a shifting, like that idea of saying, look, Matt, you're saying that, hey, if you want to be the guy who pays for his date, great, be a guy who pays for his date.
Mm-hmm.
If you hold so doggedly to that it's like, no woman is going to pay for me.
I'm worthless if you don't.
Yeah,
if I don't.
I have no value, and it means I'm no longer a man or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Then that's a problem.
Yeah, I think it robs choice, right? Because it's like, this is the only thing I can do to feel like a man, and therefore you have no choice but to accept my payment. And I'm not saying that there aren't a lot of couples who really value that and would want that and say, this is what I expect and this is what I want to give. So I think it's just like anything that eradicates choice is just bad. Like, going back to our no question, I guess, like, take some of the no out of manhood. Is there a no in there?
You just can't have manhood without a no. You can have it with
no, but I think that if there's, like we talked about at the very beginning of like starting the podcast, I think like expanding the definition of or manifestation of manhood, and maybe the only parameters are like, you're in charge of your direction, right? You have autonomy, and you also are like meaningfully connected and contributing to those around you. Like, let's just like maybe start, when you're defining manhood, start with those two parameters, right? Like, really, this goes for women, anybody, right?
Right.
Like, it's important to have choice and be able to autonomously kind of move forward through your life and decide the direction of it. And it's also important to be meaningfully connected to those around you and contributing in a positive way. So in my opinion, those should be like the primary kind of filters that everything goes through. So if I'm choosing to, be a certain way, I do have to ask those two questions, right? Is this helpful for me? Do I feel like I'm moving forward with it? And is it hurting those around me? Which isn't always like, I think you sometimes have to ask that question because of things that we've talked about, right? If I'm like, for example, if I say, hey, it's important for men to, I don't know, express or let go of feelings. And if someone says like, that's bad, right? Like it's offensive to them, then maybe I can say, well, cool, man, that's the way I do things. You don't have to, right? I think it would be helpful for you, but you think that me not doing it would be helpful. So, that's not necessarily me harming somebody else, right? But if I tell somebody like, no, you absolutely have to be this way and you have no choice, and if you do anything differently than that, then you're a horrible person and blah, 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 and we're going to shame you and we're going to isolate you. And yeah, that's probably, anything like that, I would say, is toxic in a sense that it disrupts the two prime directives.
But I think
Star Trek reference for anybody that watches it or watched it. I didn't, but I know
but
that
I can make the reference.
I know that's a term.
But I think, well, I have another question that's a little we'll see where it goes. But I think I agree with that. Like this idea of like, I am a man. This is
Yeah.
the kind of man I am.
Mhm.
Like these, and doesn't mean to say that I can't change some of these. Like I may have some behaviors that need to shift. I think that's the nature of humans in general.
Yeah.
Like I don't like this behavior. Like with my wife, if I'm saying I like to open the door for you, and she's saying it just feels like I got to stand around and wait, like,
Mhm.
and she's like, don't just leave it, like I don't want you to. It's like, okay. Now, if I really felt strongly about it and said no, I really think I need to,
Mhm.
then she'd be like, okay, go for it. Like she's like, I mean, I'm not going to always remember, but
Yeah.
I feel like, yeah. But I do think being able to stop trying to fit things into a box,
Mhm.
because it does take away our agency, like our ability to say, hey, wait, this is what's going to work for me.
Mhm.
I guess it's kind of me wondering, like, yeah, but there does have to be, or maybe I shouldn't say there has to be, I don't know. Doesn't there have to be some degree of principles, period?
Yeah, I think the flip side would be, like, to your comment, Mike, like if I need you to need me in this way for me to feel needed, if that makes
This is
sense.
deep.
And if you don't need me in that way and I try and force it on you, I mean, that's like
Yeah.
think of like the plot of like a lot of coming of age, particularly like teenage girl and father relationship movies. It's like the dad continues to try to be needed while like the daughter is trying to say, I love you, but this is the direction I'm going. Like that type of, that's where I think the fragile ego comes in. But again, I don't think that that's like just isolated to men. I think what we're
Right.
talking about is it plays out in a certain way where I feel like that is who I'm supposed to be. That's who I've tried hard to be. And right now, as I'm trying to offer that, it's not only not accepted, it's rejected. So I have to confront now the fear that comes up when you have choice and I don't feel like I'm contributing in a meaningful way and I don't know how to pivot. And I think that's where men oftentimes struggle. Like we can define those pivot points, right? So there's a really good line from a super obscure movie. Don't go watch it. You'll feel really depressed. It's called The Deep End of the Ocean.
Oh.
I used to watch it a lot for like I'd have my students watch it and do a movie analysis on it. But basically like this woman goes through this grieving process. They thought they lost their son and then they find him but she goes through this grieving process where she's kind of non-functional and her husband steps in and like overfunctions and looks really sane through the whole process. And then when she starts to do better, he doesn't know what to do. And she says to him, like, basically, I think part of you likes to be that person, right? But I don't need you to be that person anymore. And he's like, well, then he's kind of just like, I don't know what I'm doing, right? He's like, what do you need me for then?
Right.
And she says, I need you to love me. And he's like, well, I'm gonna go play with my tools. He just turns around. But I think that, like those are important pivot points where it's like, I don't know how. Maybe a lot of us guys are struggling to define like what does a non-transactional relationship look like, because maybe in some ways we see women making like some massive contributions to life. There's like that Jim Gaffigan bit where he's like, well, yeah, birth's real hard. Like this whole process, I contributed 5 minutes to the thing that I spend 24 hours a day thinking about. You're welcome. Right. And it's like, and you like carried this. So I think sometimes we are in anxious awe of women seeing like the contribution that just is a natural thing. Like you become a woman. You don't have to like prove that you're a woman. Whereas manhood, you don't like just become a man magically. You kind of have to prove that. So I think we do have a lot of our worth tied up in being needed in specific ways. And when society shifts under our feet, it's like, how do I pivot that second point of contributing in a meaningful way and being a useful part of life? And I think maybe for 30 plus years or longer, we might be clinging to things that are kind of like, that's good, but maybe something else is necessary, right?
Yeah. Like I think when I think about, well, there's one movie scene I keep thinking of. Oh, it's going to happen to us again. That I keep thinking of Dumb and Dumber, where I think it's Dumb and Dumber, where someone's on the ground, like, is it when the guy eats the spicy stuff, he's on the ground dying or whatever, and he's like, is that the one where he's like, this is a lot easier if you just lie back? Like trying to give him mouth to mouth.
He keeps like trying to sit up. It's like the exact opposite of what he needs.
So, but I also think of like, as you're talking about this, and I think even if I said, I saw some video that was like embrace gender differences, because the quote was like, women can do anything men can do, but better.
Mm-hmm.
And then it showed all these things that men do, like working on oil rigs out in the middle of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And these women are like, at the end, they're like, embrace gender differences. and I thought, it's even if there are principles that say, hey, this is masculine or male, and this is feminine or female.
Mm-hmm.
I think the mistake we make is thinking, okay, whatever, I have to find a way to do those things.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, sports. If we say that is inherently masculine, then it's like, well, then I have to play sports or I'm not masculine.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying, okay, well, maybe the idea behind that is, if it's sports, why? Well, I want to use my body or my mind, or it's the competition. It's like, oh, I do those things. I do it in this way.
Mm-hmm.
So I can still fall into these, even if they were, delivered by the very hand of God, saying these are the principles, saying, okay, but how does that look for me?
Yeah.
It's a little bit like when, now I'm drawing, Doug Smith at Tech, when he said, which I've mentioned this podcast before, don't try to find the theory that you like and see if you can fit into it. Figure out what you already believe about humans and change, and find the theory that matches with that.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking, in theory, we should be saying, even if there is a definition of men, you don't have to contort to be that. You say, okay, well, what are the principles beneath that I already have that are inherent
Mm-hmm.
to me? So if this guy's saying, in order to be male, I have to pay for this woman's dinner on my first date, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, essentially the principle would be, no, I believe that part of being male is taking care of my partner.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, there's 80 ways you could do that. Like, it doesn't have to be that way only. And even that, we may not say is inherently male. You could just say it's inherently you, or whatever it is. But try not to contort so much, because otherwise I think that categorical thing is problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Mike, I know you haven't said a ton, and maybe you have thoughts on that, but I also want to ask another question, because I know
What did you say while we were gone?
Yeah,
Nothing.
yeah. What?
There's going to be a whole big chunk of me staring at the screen and me being on my phone that Robbie's going to have to just edit right out.
No, I want him to just leave that, or I wish you would have been like this. Okay, look, guys, I want to tell you a couple of things about these guys.
I thought about it.
You should have done like, the working environment is really toxic for me. These guys are really hard to work with, and this is kind of my
That's
cry.
why I had to move.
It's kind of my cry for help, please.
They think I moved for other reasons, but I didn't. I had to get away.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, because if I look at this and I look at history and I look at even 30 years ago that we're saying the same thing, and in 30 years, it's like, I don't know if we've progressed at all. Do you believe it's possible to actually shift? Like, there are so many things right now trying to help men. Do you believe it's possible to do it? And maybe Matt, you're already answering the second part. If so, how? I mean, you're kind of maybe answering some of that. Mike, I want to know what your thoughts are too, though.
Do I believe it's possible to help men, or
Well,
for men to actually kind of change in
specifically
this area?
To change this narrative we have that's actually very confining. Like, these examples we're giving today seem to be that these narratives that we're trying hard to shift, which the methodology lately seems to have been, we will shift these narratives through shaming. We'll call it toxic masculinity, and it needs to be eradicated. Mm-hmm. And since the beginning of this, Matt, you used to say a lot, and I think you still do, like, hey, we don't have to, just because you do this stuff doesn't mean you're toxic. Doesn't mean you're a bad guy if you, still be masculine. It's fine. It's okay to be a dude.
Yeah.
Like, so I guess I'm wondering, is it possible, and not for the three of us, but like for humanity, to shift our narrative of men in ways that it feels like what we're talking about? I can define what kind of man I am because I am a man, not like I will prove I'm a man. That should be already taken at face value to say, you are a man. Tell me what kind of man you are so I can add to my enlightenment about what men are. Instead of saying, well, you don't look like a man because there's 3 things that men are and you don't fit those. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's the eradication part, or the enlightenment thing this person is claiming, is you have to throw that out totally. It's like, no, don't throw it out. It should be saying, let's expand this. Mm-hmm. Enlightenment is expansion to me. So it's saying, let's keep moving this further and getting bigger.
Yeah.
So yes, I guess I am saying, is it possible to shift that narrative, and how do we do it? That's very existential.
It's funny. I think the optimist part of me, which is a really small part compared to the other, but wants to believe, yes, we can, right? Even though I'm looking at these things and I'm thinking 30 years in it, we're still having the same conversations and we're still struggling with the same issues. And I mean, we've talked a lot on here about how we struggle with feeling like failures as fathers, as providers, as like all of those areas, right? That he addressed. I think, yeah, each of us has our own struggle with those. And I think one thing but I do want to believe, yes, change can happen. One of the things that I think has been hard for me is we want it to happen quickly. My wife and I were talking about something, and she was struggling with not having things happen fast enough. And she said, and then I thought, if I were to say I'm training to run a marathon, she said, and on day 2, I got upset with myself for being winded at the end of a mile. She's like, I wouldn't think, wow, this sucks, I'm terrible. I would think, right, I'm training to run 26 of these. Like, this is going to take time to build up. It's not going to happen overnight. So if it's going to take our physical body that long, why wouldn't it take our mental and emotional selves that long? One of the things that kind of kept coming to mind for me as you guys were talking is a lot of these things are things that a week ago, 2 years ago, 10 years ago, we didn't think were wrong. And now we're being told, no, if you think that way, if you act that way, you're wrong.
Right.
Well, now we don't know what to do. Like, I can't even wrap my head around the fact that I'm wrong. And you want me to already be doing something different? I'm still struggling with the fact that I've apparently been wrong for 45 years. Like, I got to get my head around that before I can start to make change. But when we don't, when it doesn't happen fast enough, that's when we start being told, well, you're toxic. No, I'm struggling to figure this out. Like, I'm struggling to understand what's wrong with opening the door for a woman. What's wrong with picking up the tab? Why is that a bad thing? And so then it just kind of came back to that idea of like, right, this is going to take time. And a lot of it, I think, does come from this idea of broadening the definition, right? This is something that in Sexuality Snarch talks about, right? That we need to broaden the definition of what a sexual experience is. That it, if it's just defined by orgasm, then yeah, like we're not going to have very many sexual experiences. And statistically, a woman will have even fewer, because if orgasm is required, she's, statistically speaking, not going to have it as often as the guy. So,
Which means we're failing as procreators.
right, we're terrible. Which was one of the questions that was asked. Why is that a hard thing for guys? Because again, that's part of the definition of masculinity for us, is the ability to satisfy our spouse.
Yeah.
In his sexual nature. But that's the thing, right? Like, again, even that statement, I think, yeah, coming back to Snarch and that idea of like, yeah, but broaden what it is. Because your wife could be very satisfied because you're just cuddling one night and that's it. And that's all she wants. And you've had a sexual experience and she's satisfied. So way to go. You nailed it. Like you hit the benchmark for the procreation area. And so a lot of it is just that idea of like, you have to look to broaden what you are. And a lot of it comes from figuring out how you see yourself. I was talking to someone who during COVID, they're a performer, and during COVID they couldn't perform. And they told me they really kind of struggled with this because like they realized, oh, this is more of my identity than I thought it was. And so we talked about like, okay, but like, who are you if you take that away then? Like, what happens if you take that away and you take the business part away? Like, who are you? What do you contribute to the world? What do you add to the world? Which sounded terrible when I said it.
What would you say you do here?
Yeah, that's exactly what it felt like. But like, to me, it is a valuable question to be able to look and say, okay, what is it about performing that lets me feel like I add value? Well, because I'm bringing joy to these people. I can see their response. I can watch their energy increase when I do what I do. Or on the business side, well, because I'm offering a product that I know makes their lives better. I'm helping. And if we can dig to the why as opposed to the what, I think that's where we'll start to be able to shift and make change.
Yeah, I agree with the time frame too, because like as you were talking about that, I was thinking those that hold still really valuable components of traditional masculinity are kind of like the stake drivers, and those that are wanting to add like additional elements to masculinity and maybe distance themselves from some of those things are the ones that are carrying the corner of the tent, over to put another stake in. but like the problem is the size of the freaking tent. It's teeny right now, right? So there's a lot of like tug of war going on, but maybe over the last 30 years, the accumulation of stories and conversations and experiences are kind of like, those are like the canvas weavers, right? Like how are we expanding the size of the tent so that we can still stay staked to things that are really valuable, that have worked, but that felt maybe a bit confining because it was all there was. Otherwise, you were like outside the tent. And how can we give freedom for people to expand the corners of the tent, but and understand the need to go claim new ground in terms of masculinity? Like we could sit there and say who's right, or we could jump in and start weaving the freaking canvas. Like, and I think that's what we're trying to do, and I think that's what a lot of men are doing. Is like, here's another part of it, here's another part of it, right? And here's the value in the thing that maybe we want to throw out, right? Here are maybe the risks of like picking up something new as the new standard that everybody now must live by. Like aren't we just doing the same thing with a new set of characteristics of manhood, right? Like we have to have these conversations, but I think I think in general, it's kind of weird to think of it this way, but I think in general, when men have conversations with each other where they just confidently say, this is who I am, almost always the response you get from the other guy is like, oh, cool.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's okay. It's different. But I think it's when there's lack of confidence or lack of surety that that's who you are, then that gets pulled around. And maybe what's happening is it's not so much like I disagree with what you're saying about manhood. I'm just picking up on your insecurity, and insecurity doesn't go well for anybody. So let me like push on that so you put it away, or challenge it so that you strengthen it. And I think if more people can confidently say, and that I think happens when you find people like you and you realize other guys think this too. And so I feel more confident because there's strength in numbers. So now when I'm individually talking to somebody, I can say, you know what, I'm not the only guy that thinks this, right? And sometimes you get guys on the listening end of that conversation saying, oh yeah, me too, but I didn't know there were guys like that, right? Or guys that just respect and say, cool, man, like that's the contribution you're making. I think one of the things that worries me as we kind of make this transition is that economically we're becoming much more I guess narrow in terms of what we value. Like societies, if you look, not to bring up the Roman Empire, but I think in Greece this happened too. Like when you start to undervalue the arts and some of the more I guess what could be defined by like a really strict definition of masculinity, what could be defined as like feminine elements of a society, it falls apart. So like think of how like if you're thinking of the men in your life that have touched your life, and even if you haven't ever met them, like who's your favorite musician? You know, who's the guy that designed the building you work in? Who's the guy that wrote a book that really spoke to you and touched you, at an important time in your life? Mm-hmm. Who's the guy that paved the road that you're driving your kids to soccer practice on? Like, just think of all the different contributions that make your life what it is, and realize that as a man, you can be a part of all of those things, or we need men to be a part of all of those things. And you'll find very different men, right? Men that share a lot of commonality, but there's all sorts of different interests and passions. And I think when we just kind of like narrow in, I understand the focus on STEM, because that may be like, that's where a lot of the jobs are going to be. Mm-hmm. So there's value in doing things that are going to lead to a livelihood for you. But the fact that that is what's happening, that's the only place you're going to have a way to contribute to society and make a living, that's pretty depressing. Like that's a real narrowing of our lived experience, who we're going to be filling all these other roles, So I don't know. Widen the tent.
That's I think my kind of, I guess my take home thought after hearing what you guys are saying is, I think it's a mistake. If we're actually going to make movement forward, we have to stop pendulum swinging or dichotomizing everything. This is good and this is bad, or this is masculine and this is toxic masculinity. Or, I mean, really, most men, if you ask them, what's masculinity now, basically anything they would label, they'd also say, but that's also been labeled as toxic masculinity. So it's like they don't even know anymore because we pendulum swung from over here. And in this book, when it's talking about in the 1930s and 40s, it was like men were, the husbands were or fathers were kind of absent, or not absent, but they were distant, and they were whatever, they were organization men, and they were but now it's shifted, which is good, but we can't make these pendulum like shifts or these gargantuan leaps, because we're just going to fall on our faces instead of saying, okay, look, like I actually sat here thinking to any spaceman listening, hey, you are a man, so think of the things that kind of define you as a human, and some of those things will be that define you as a man. Not all of those things like that are going to be inherent to men only, or things like that. I don't think that's true of almost anything, but I think those define you as a human. You don't have to worry, do I fit? You have to say, look, it is assumed you are a man. And so now you're just saying, okay, what is it that I'm bringing to the table as a man? And that could be, with my wife, it's not like she said, never open the door for me. Sometimes I do. When we go on dates, she kind of likes it to like wait and let me open the door for her, but this idea of like you throw it all out or you eradicate, I feel like that is just, when has that helped? Like what you're describing, Matt, with the Roman Empire, and Mike, you're saying some of this too, like the idea of patience, even you didn't use that word, but it's like the Roman Empire thing, and saying, well, let's just cut this one part out. Anytime we cut stuff out, it's like, that's not going to work. That just makes me feel like, well, crap, that was my thing. I guess I don't have a thing anymore. So I guess I don't fit here anymore.
Yeah. And if you go back to those definitions, right,
Yeah.
It's like every single one of those is I'm providing something useful.
Right. Yeah. And that's what that's what he gets at, that once your providing is done, we have no need for you anymore. No one loves you just for being you. That's the deep end of the ocean thing you're talking about.
Yeah.
Like, just love me. So I think it matters to be able to say, look, in our own thinking, don't be so black or white. Don't be so dichotomous. Don't be so this or that. Make space to say, okay, well, that's something I hadn't considered. Like it should always be, I guess, like I said, to me, enlightenment is expansion. Like it should be adding to what you know, and maybe reframing some of what you know. Because maybe you could say, well, I always thought men were only this. Well, you should be recognizing that, well, no, we're not only that, right? Hopefully there's a loosening and a softening those edges. It's the only way to move forward in a direction that's not just going to keep teeter-tottering back and forth forever.
Yeah.
So ease up, spaceman. Jeez. And tell your wives to get off your back. And then
that goes over.
Catch us next time on The Man Space. This is a lot easier if you just lie back. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Please remember to
Rate
and
review.
please, we desperately need it.